Hello, I'm Eric Snodgrass, and thank you for watching this May 29th Memorial Day in-depth ag forecast brought to you by Nutrien Ag Solutions. Well, here on Memorial Day, I was watching a lot of the satellite data, just kind of revealing what the pattern has really been kind of stuck with for a while. And as you just notice here, again, a lot of storms firing up along the plains, especially the western plains, getting up into the Rocky Mountains. And numerous storms continue to pop right into this area, delivering showers and storms throughout this part of the Intermountain West into Montana and out here into the plains. We are watching quite a few thunderstorm clusters move through Texas, and over the weekend we watched this low. Watch this in animation here. I'll show you from sun up here. We watched this low that's still spinning here over parts of North Carolina, Virginia. That one delivered quite a bit of rain. In fact, some of it made it much farther to the west than I thought. So we're talking about Tennessee, Kentucky. We'll take a look at those rainfall totals in a few seconds. But as we just kind of end this animation, over the weekend, you may have heard about this a bit in the news. There were some very large wildfires right here in what we commonly just refer to as the Canadian Maritimes. This is Nova Scotia, and you can see some of that wildfire smoke there. In addition to that, there's actually quite a few fires still going on right now in parts of Saskatchewan and Manitoba. You can see some of the wildfire smoke here as I just play through the day today. See the very large fires here. Of course, most of this is north of where most of the crop is grown here. This is all in a forested area pretty far to the north. But I also just noticed here as large storms were exploding here into parts of Manitoba that the farther north you went, all of this you see here in the Hudson Bay is still ice. There's still a lot of ice cover in this area. Just kind of fascinating to look at these other parts of North America. But over the weekend, as we watched the smoke getting pushed around by the flow of the atmosphere, we've seen a couple of things begin to shift, and those are things we really got to spend some time talking about. Before I do that, this is what the latest forecast going out over the next about 24 hours looks like in terms of where that smoke is going. So most of our new wildfire smoke, again, coming from here. And why it's not spreading yet pretty far to the south is because there is a larger ridge that's kind of got its grip on the pattern right now. And if we start to see this moving around and shifting more, getting pushed farther to the south, that's going to be an indicator of some change. So just all sorts of different ways by which we try to assess where the pattern might be showing up with some sort of a shove in a different direction. But over the weekend, we did get very heavy rains in both of the Carolinas, getting back into the Appalachian Mountains here into West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, also up into parts of Virginia. So this was really well forecast by the models last week. Brought in a cold and wet weekend, but I think a lot of us would trade that for any sort of risk of early season drought development. I was also just happy to see over the last 72 hours storms blowing up right here in the Mississippi Valley. This is one of our drier areas. And then we just continue to see this setting up, right? So we've got the storms just kind of rolling across this area and then just popping here in the mountains. And that's just been driven overall by the lack of stronger flow aloft. So the mountains are serving as the trigger, the heat from them, the upslope flow. We kind of discussed this quite a bit. And there is a subtropical component of the jet coming in on the bottom side of this, or the southern side of this, helping to kind of continue that flow. But overall, the last 14 days has looked something like this. So our last 2 weeks, getting here to the end of May, we have some places that have not measured any precipitation, and that would be your deepest reds that you see throughout much of the Midwest, the upper Midwest, the northern plains, getting into New England, and then down here into parts of the Missouri and Mississippi Valley, going farther to the south. Now, it is not uncommon for this part of the country to be dry during this time. And we've been dry here along the I-5 corridor, getting down into the Central Valley of California. The end of May, this is really the May is the start of the dry season for much of the western United States. But we can now start to identify those places that have been wet. Substantial recovery in terms of the drought picture in parts of Montana, then along the western and high plains all the way down into Texas. And just what a remarkably different year we've seen here for this part of the Cotton Belt as an example, given that last year we were already just deep into drought and the temperatures were already pushing into the hundreds. And here we are this year, a complete opposite pattern of that. We've been wet in pockets of the southeast as well, including lots and lots of areas throughout Florida. There are some drier pockets in Florida, but overall we just see most of our moisture here. So we have just big questions that need answered as we go forward. And we started to build this story over the last 10 days or so that we do think things are going to start to break down from where they've been. So I need to tell you where they've been. This has been kind of the biggest issue overall. What I've done is I've gone from about the 12th of May, so that would be after we finished getting all of that rain in the midsection of the country. And it covered a lot of area here. From then up until this past weekend, this is what's gone on. Now, you know we live in the westerly wind belt. So on average, our winds just kind of come out of this direction. This is showing you anomalous jet stream level winds. We're looking for where there's differences. And we just see there's the ridge, okay? And then notice that right in through this area, the wind, which is normally going in this direction, has been so slow and at times even reversed. And that's the wrong direction to take flow on average if you want to return moisture to this region. So it's been incredibly weak. We can look at this a couple other ways. This is just looking at what we call the zonal component. So zonal means west to east. If we looked at meridional, that's north to south. And when I keep mentioning to you that we've just pulled all of the momentum out of the atmosphere, this is what I'm referring to. There is no strong westerly component. So if you pull that out, there's nothing to advect or to move or to get things to initiate a new look in the atmosphere. It just gets stuck on where it is. We start to look for why things have gotten stuck. And one of the things we start to point out here is that certainly the MJO has preferred phases 6 and 7 with a lot of subsidence over India, getting into the central Indian Ocean. So our rising motion is here, our sinking motion is there, and it's actually put a lot of sinking motion in the atmosphere in this part of the world as well. And if we think about that again, what it looks like kind of from a top-down perspective is the jet streams kind of popped up over in a little ridge here, but then dove into a trough in this region. And then there's that ridge I was mentioning. And it's really sat from the Hudson Bay all the way to the western side of Canada. And the deeper troughs have been kind of tucked away here north of Greenland. And so this is the pattern that when we all say we need to break away from it, if we're going to start to return rain to places that need it, this is the pattern we're talking about. And I can really I feel like I can attribute a lot of the behavior to this for the fact that the MJO got stuck in phase 7 for a while. Because what that did was that kind of put some troughing off the west coast. That's common when that happens. And just kind of ridging here with some troughing over the east. And so what this ends up doing is it just ends up killing all the flow in the pattern. The flow is just taken away. It's put out over the Pacific Ocean. And we just don't see it a lot here across North America. You can see the lower heights here. We can also see the ridging that happens over parts of Europe into Russia. And sure enough, that we've had that happening. See these 3 components. I think we can really just attribute this to what the MJO has been up to. Now, the MJO is forecast to just linger a bit longer see, it's been in phase 6 and phase 7. It's forecast to come through briefly into phase 8. But honestly, we need it to pop out into phases 1, 2, and 3 to really energize or just move the atmosphere in a different direction. Because there is, as we've just learned more and more about the way this atmosphere works, there is a lot of teleconnection, a lot of forcing in the flow of the entire atmosphere that happens in the tropics. So I think right now, it'll be most important to see that MJO begin its move and to come into phases, especially phase 2 and 3. Now what that means is we would flip this pattern over and stop having all the rising motion there, but get it somewhere in here. And if that occurs, we can start to reposition the way the jet comes off of China and Japan and start to really influence the way that it moves over the Aleutian Islands and off the west coast. And downstream of all of that is North America. So you see how we always look at the upstream drivers to determine where the downstream factors are going to go. Now, I've heard a lot of people lately just really trying to make a big story out of something called the Southern Oscillation Index. And the Southern Oscillation Index is a measure of the pressure difference between Tahiti, which is here, okay, and Darwin, which is there. So remember last week we talked about Sir Gilbert Walker and his study of the trade wind pattern, and we called it the Southern Oscillation. Well, the Southern Oscillation Index, for a very long time, we had a weather station in Darwin and one in Tahiti. So we began to measure the pressure difference because the pressure difference across these 2 areas told us what the trade winds are up to. So remember, the trade winds come in like this. You can actually see them quite well here in the Northern Hemisphere, and they tend to come in like that. And what drives those trade winds is a pressure difference, one in the central equatorial Pacific and one over here in Darwin. Now, I want to make sure that we don't attribute too much to it. Oftentimes we do that. We get latched onto one thing and say, this is it. This is what's driving the pattern. But that Southern Oscillation Index just really took a nosedive. And when it drops, these negative values are indicative of El Nino conditions. In other words, we've lost the strong trade winds. So the Southern Oscillation Index has been diving. But its dive down here is just more of an indicator, honestly, of what the MJO is up to. That's really what it does. And then you could wrap the MJO into El Nino La Nina. You can wrap El Nino La Nina into global atmospheric momentum. That's what we do. We just try to cascade downward into smaller and smaller bits and then build it all back up to understand what the pattern's doing. That's what I spend my days doing here. So I need you to know that these are the things we've been watching most carefully. And here's what the newest kind of outcome of all of this is. Now, the top thing we need to watch, if you are in North America, is we need to watch if the momentum can build in the jet stream here and start to change the pattern across North America. Because this is what the jet stream winds look like today on Monday when I'm recording this. All of the strongest winds are down here in the westerly winds that are in the southern hemisphere. They go like that. So we actually have two westerly wind belts. They look just like this. Then we have the wind belts that do this. That would be the trade winds. And then finally, we have the polar easterlies, and they go off in this direction. Okay, so that's it. They kind of mirror each other, northern, southern hemisphere. All right, as we play forward, getting through this week, notice that there is a good subtropical component to the jet. The Pacific jet is trying to nudge its way out here, getting south of the Aleutian Islands, but the flow is very weak over much of North America, which means this entire next week is still a repeat of what I've been telling you now for the last 10 to 15 days. What happens after June the 4th, 5th, and 6th? I see a piece of this jet extending. I also see going out there past the 6th, 7th, and 8th, the ridge that has been sitting here begin to retrograde. That just means move west. And if that occurs, and we start to change this up, by the time we get out here past the 7th, 8th, and 9th, we will begin to see a different flow. The split's going to happen like that and come down here. And we're going to start to return better chances of moisture to some places that have been very, very dry. But do you see what happened? If the MJO made its move, we now get this better extension of the jet. And that just changes everything upstream. We're always looking for something to spark the change. Now let's look at this another way. We're going to go top-down view here on the North Pole, and we're going to look for what happens to the weak flow. So honestly, what I want you to look at is maybe not so much the colors. Again, the reds represent ridges, the blues represent troughs. I want you to look more about the spacing. That tells you the winds as well. So right now, over this next week, very weak flow across the midsection of the country. So the heat pours in here throughout the week. I'm talking about right in this area. Stays cooler west. Stays wet in the mountains. It stays stormy along the plains. And we're going to have to watch for anything to come out of, the southeast and curl up the east coast as possible another system that could roll through. But then as we get out there, this is June 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. There it is. That is the massive ridge that sets up with this pattern. So all the flow is dipping south of it, and this is cut off, and it sticks around. So we knew this was going to be here for maybe the first 8 to 10 days of June, adding to the problems we've been seeing for the last 2 weeks. So let's come back to it. What we're watching for is by the 5th, 6th, and 7th. The ridge in the models is trying to back itself up over the mountains. And what's keeping it from doing it sooner is this trough right here. Now, if you are in the Midwest, and we see and talk about all summer long troughs over the Aleutian Islands, the flow comes up and over the top like this, and we tend to really run the risk of drought the farther east you go. The western part tends to get storms, kind of like we're seeing now, but we're going to watch for that to fade. And what we end up getting here is we get out there about June 11th. Now, do you see the spacing of the lines? They're much tighter together here. And that is going to help increase some northwest flow. That's going to help to just put a little bit more squeeze, some more flow in the atmosphere to get the air to rise, and we're going to start to see better chances of precipitation. But it's not for the first 10 days of this month. That's when the pattern's going to change is after that. So as we stitch this story together, here's what the next week looks like. It's almost on repeat. I am going to watch another coastal system come up in this direction. Storms almost on repeat every day here. And I'll just expand this squiggling up into parts of Alberta and Saskatchewan, but also into Montana. Storm corridor remains in this area as well. Now, when do we fill in the rest of this? As we just take a look out there, this is the next 10 days on the probability of getting at least another inch of precipitation. And I'll be honest with you, you look at this area, overlay it with the latest drought monitor, my goodness, this is just, this we can start to actually call drought busting. But we want to know, when do we start to push this? So this is June 8th, and as I just take it out, we get these indications that the atmosphere is going to try to increase the chances for storms over some of the areas that it's been most dry. Now, this isn't, ending the dry stretches we had. It's just starting to see the improvement in the moisture coming into those areas. But I want to show you that between now and the next 10 days, which includes, of course, the first 8 days of June, our probability of keeping less than a half inch is really strong around the Great Lakes, getting back into Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Missouri, this whole region and through here. So that's where we're going to see stay dry going forward over the next 10 days. Really, when you compare this to average, that's the biggest anomaly because we know drier in this area is quite common for this time of year. All right, week 2. This is the newest updates from the CPC, the European model, and the GFS. While we continue to see the models honing in on drier pattern here, I'd like to make a point that the weekend model trends for this time period have backed off on how significant that drier weather is going to be, because these start to look out there past the 8th, including the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th, and that's when we expect the pattern to be a bit more energized. Now, during this time period, we got to pay close attention to these temperatures because over the next 5 days, there's a lot of heat pouring into this area, very hot compared to normal. Cloud cover and precipitation keeping it cooler here. We're cooler in California for the most part. And as we look out there into date 5 through 10, again, the epicenter of the heat is really centered in parts of Manitoba getting over to Ontario, but this gets into the upper Midwest and the Midwest, while we just remain cooler right here into this part of Texas, really in all the surrounding states. So to show you what these temperatures are going to do, let's start you off here. Let's go to Tuesday because a lot of you are going to watch this on Tuesday. Watch the heat build into this area as we go from Tuesday into Wednesday. Now we're seeing 90s in this area going into Thursday. This is summer-like heat. Friday, very hot day here on June the 2nd and going into Saturday and Sunday. So that whole week is set, but do you notice the heat starting to come back into the Pacific Northwest? This is the beginning of that change we want to see in the pattern, taking the heat back in this direction. And the Pacific Northwest will welcome this heat. We need to pour some heat on this crop in the Pacific Northwest. So that's out there to next Sunday. Over the next 7 days, this is a look at the total accumulated GDDs. So now we see these numbers here in parts of the upper Midwest that are cranking out 160 GDDs in a week. So that's a lot of heat pouring into this crop, but as you know, we're not putting a lot of water on this. So we start to ask ourselves about what the stress might be on it. Total evaporation in this next week. Now remember, this is a bare soil calculation. You also have to remember that if you don't have the moisture in the bare soil, this doesn't happen. It's a potential, all right? But it could be somewhere between, 1 inch and 3/4 up to 2 inches in this region. These numbers are very common for this area. Same thing for the Columbia Basin this time of year. All right, does the pattern begin to show some changes once we get out there past June 8th? And most models agree that it does. At that point, the jet starts to build its ridge back over the west. We get flow that comes in, and it's cooler in here. So it's about a week, maybe 8 days of heat that's coming in here throughout this week into early next week that we're going to be watching very carefully. All right, from there, what are we seeing in terms of the catalyst to get things to move around? Well, throughout this entire week, from today, Monday, all the way till Friday, this line right here indicates what the ridge is doing in the United States. Whenever you see the Pacific North American pattern showing up with a negative value, that's a trough over the west coast. When it has a positive value, that's a ridge. This is the retrograding ridge. And the sooner it gets there, the better the chances are of bringing relief to the Midwest and parts of the lower Mississippi River Valley, getting into the East Coast, those dry areas. This is the thing that needs to set up to start to deliver that. The other thing that's helping this out is we're going to come back to the MJO. The MJO has got to move itself into the Indian Ocean, and there's some indications that it's going to do so. So right now, if you kind of look at this, these colors represent where for the last 10 days, all of the subsidence in the atmosphere has been here, while the rising motion has been in phases 6 and 7, which are located here. So phase 3 versus phases 6 and 7. Now what's the pattern doing? The sinking motion begins to move to where it sets up here. We start to see some rising motion coming into this area. That's the catalyst to start to get this pattern to move and to shift. So what do we end up getting out of it? Here's the long range. Newest data from the Climate Prediction Center. This is their outlook for week 2. They've now shrunk the area that's going to be expected to stay below normal. We now see cooler weather showing up in this corridor, and we see the heat pouring into the Pacific Northwest. Their week 3, week 4 forecast, I'll be very excited to see this getting updated late this week, because they continue through June 10th to the 23rd. That's the time frame, week 3, week 4, June 10th through the 23rd, of bringing cooler weather into this area. There's going to be warmer conditions. They've got it mainly for the East Coast, Southeast, down to the South. But I think when we get the new forecast from them next Friday, they will modify this quite a bit. And what I think they're going to do is they're really going to change up the wettest corridor to kind of stick right in through this area, right in through here. And some of the reason for that is we continue to see that the CFSV2 model paints this corridor wetter going forward. That's week 3. That's June 12th through the 18th. And here's the new week 4. Now remember, we don't look at the CFS V2 model in isolation. We never look at a single run of it. But you've now seen that I've shown you this for the last about, I think, 7 or 8 days. It continues to show this being the pattern for June. And we have reason to believe that because the PNA is changing. That's where the ridge will be in North America. And the MJO is moving back to the Indian Ocean. Those 2 things alone are important enough to start to get this pattern to get kicked and go forward. The European model released today isn't showing it just yet. They are showing that once during that time period that we're going to get a wetter corridor in through where I'm showing you these 2 arrows. So this area is going to start to fill in. But the European model just maintains this drier bias overall from parts like the Red River of the North through the upper Mississippi Valley, through the eastern Great Lakes, and then back around into Ontario and Manitoba. And that setup just has me concerned and worried about when we're going to break this away. Now, the temps are going to fall back off, but I need to see the atmosphere make a few more adjustments before I can really be confident in telling you that we're going to pull moisture back into this area. So as it stands, if I could just modify this again, I tend right now to lend the most credence, I guess, to seeing this corridor open up for storms, but not, we have 10 days before this is going to happen. All right, overall, does that cure this? No, my biggest worry here is that some of the early season deficits mean that we have to have routine rain through June, July, and August, which is normal, but we don't have a full profile in the soil moisture to sustain us. So that means we will be kind of hanging on critical rainfall forecasts for the next, honestly, probably 2 to 3 months. And we're just going to watch it to see if that can come through and really begin to eat away at this. Lastly, I want to make a point here about the longer range, the really long range forecast, because on June the 5th, we will get new updates from the ECMWF. They're always first. The PDO signal faded a lot in May, but there's still cold water here. We've seen some cooler water showing up here. And there's definitely some colder water, primarily from a typhoon, into this area. Our worst and driest years on record for the central United States, which make the best years on record for the West, there was just cold water everywhere outside of this arrow. So we had La Nina, cold water here, cold water there, cold water here. It's just cold everywhere. We're not quite there yet. What is unprecedented about this year is the pace at which El Nino continues to develop, the extent of the warm water that's in the North Pacific, and the extent of the warm water in the North Atlantic, save the Gulf Stream. And that's something I honestly have looked back, and I can't find a good kind of replica of that or analog. I think we're in a bit of uncharted territory here, and the Indian Ocean's playing a big role in this as well. So this is the biggest uncertainty I have going forward in this forecast, knowing what to do with these 3 large epicenters, or 4 regions, I guess I could say, of highly anomalously warm ocean temperatures. Are they going to continue to rob momentum from the jet stream? Or at one point, are they going to start to pump some momentum back into it and get things going? That's a big question I got to spend the next probably week or 2 weeks trying to answer. I still have a date for you. June 21st is going to be critical as we look at what the pattern is going to set up for summer. Lastly, I just want to point out in South America that we are continuing to see the chances for those rains to come into southern Brazil this week, right there. So midweek this week, hitting Mato Grosso over toward Paraná, Sao Paulo. These are the rains that are needed to kind of kick this last little bit into the safrinha crop and really help it go a long way. So I'll leave you with that, and I look forward to talking to you again tomorrow morning. Thanks.